Welcome to another episode of the Corrosion Journal interview series. My name is Sammy Miles, and I'm the managing editor-in-chief of Corrosion Journal, AMP's peer-reviewed scientific journal. Today, we're starting a multi-part series on corrosion and health, with today's conversation on metals and protective coatings with toxic effects on the body. I'm joined by Yolanda Hedberg with Western University in Ontario, Canada, and Gerald Frankel with The Ohio State University. Thank you for joining me today.
Nice to be here.
Before we dive into today's discussion, can you provide a little information about yourself for our listeners? Let's start with you, Jerry.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a professor at Ohio State University in the Department of Material Science and Engineering, and the director of the Fontana Corrosion Center here at OSU. I've been here now for over 28 years, so that's a long time. And before that, I was at IBM in the Watson Research Center in Yorktown Heights, New York. And I have a wide interest in corrosion, studied all different aspects of corrosion, including coatings and corrosion protection, which borders on this topic. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Jerry. And over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Yolanda Hedberg. I'm a professor at Western University in chemistry and a Canada researcher in corrosion science. I came here 3 years ago from Sweden, so I did my PhD at KDH in corrosion science and also postdoc in metal allergy, actually, at Karolinska Institute. And my background is material science from Germany, from Friedrich Alexander University.
Wonderful. To set the stage for our conversation today, I want to touch on some of the types of products that contain metals or that have protective coatings to prevent corrosion that we use every day that come into contact with our skin or that may be ingested, whether that's something that we eat or drink or inhale. So what are some of these products and industries? And let's start with Yolanda on this one.
Yeah, so the most obvious when you think about ingestion is, of course, anything that comes into contact with your food or beverages. So there's a lot of processing equipment, stainless steel, pumps, stirring, hot temperature, salty, alkaline environments where you get a lot of corrosion. And those metals or coatings could go into the food and change it, could make it different, even toxic in some cases. And then, of course, if you think about children, they take everything in the mouth, right? So that would be clothes, toys, iPads, of course. They start with that earlier and earlier. And then when you think about skin contact, it's almost anything in our daily life, laptops, iPads, electronics, the car, the bike, whatever. But also infrastructure, outdoor infrastructure. When you take the staircase you are holding, right? So any products. So, and for inhalation, we think about particles, and particles are usually either wear particles or combustion particles. And both of them can contain a lot of chemicals. You would see the alloy composition of the brake in the particles. In the subway, you can smell the metal smell a little bit that's coming from the copper rail or from the railway. So there's a lot of, and those particles in our lungs are also corroding and influencing the health.
Yeah, and I can just add on to that. I think beyond the contact of, our contact in our daily life, a big focus, I think, is on worker contact. So clearly in factories, during manufacture, during repair, the workers can be exposed to higher concentrations of all of these chemicals that we're going to talk about. So that's one concern. And I think the other one that will come out is through our water supply. So not just the products, but that as a result of waste from whatever source, from our waste disposal or corrosion in the environment that then through water into our water streams. So all of that, getting down into the water table can then get into humans through our drinking water.
And With that, why is that a concern? What are some of the ramifications that we've seen with these metals and coatings and different chemicals that we have on our bodies and in our bodies? Like what do we see from that?
Yeah, so one thing to remember here, whenever I give like lectures about toxicity, people are really scared, but you should remember that even water is toxic if you have a too high dose. It's always a question of the dose and um, the situation, right? So, but we do see toxicity for every chemical, right? It's just a question of how much and what is it doing. So if we are looking at metals, it's quite known the toxicity. Um, there is metal allergy. It's people might know about nickel allergy. That's quite common. But you can get allergic to almost any of the metal of the periodic table. It's just a question of how rare it is and how potent and how much is the dose that you get exposed to. Cancer is an issue for many metals as well, nickel, chromium 6, cobalt, and neurodegenerative diseases as well. And then I mentioned particles before. They are actually the cause for our longest life shortening in the US. There were estimations that would say if we would change to a fossil-free economy today, we would save money because we would prolong our lives so much because we don't inhale as many particles. So it's quite a huge economic impact, and it causes stroke, cardiovascular diseases, almost any disease you can imagine, because those particles can go deep into the lung and into your bloodstream, and they can cause a lot of problems. And it doesn't really matter what composition they are, it's just the size as well. And then there are isocyanates, glue, paints, rubber, and polymer chemicals that all can cause allergic reactions and different diseases.
Yeah, let me just follow on to what Yolanda said. I mean, it's really fascinating, isn't it, that you can, die from drinking too much water, right? And it's all about our metabolic processes. So, but even metals we know chromium is bad, right? But that's Yolanda mentioned chromates, so that's chromium in the 6+ oxidation state. But our vitamin supplements will contain chromium in the 3+ oxidation state, right? So we need all kinds of ions for proper metabolic function, right? So the sports drinks should have the right mix of, right? So if you are doing a marathon, right, you don't just drink water. You could die if you just drink water, right? So they're drinking Gatorade or a sport drink with the right combination. So chemicals themselves are not bad. We are made of chemicals, right? It's just the right chemicals. But I would say that most of the hydrocarbon polymers, are not good for humans, right? So they're man-made chemicals are we don't have millennia of experience with it in our bodies. So it's not necessarily bad for us, but probably not good for us, right? So there's a lot of chemicals that we use in industrial applications that can impact our health negatively, I would say. But not all chemicals are bad. So that was a really good point, Yolanda.
Yeah, I appreciate that from both of y'all. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but if we broaden it beyond those that we're in contact with day to day, what are some additional products and industries that use protective coatings or use some of these chemicals that have posed health complications over the years? I know, Jerry, you started talking about in the workplace and manufacturing, but are there some specific examples you can provide?
Right. So well, we can go back to chromate, right? So chromate is just one of the great corrosion inhibitors that we have, right? So I like to say you can take chromate and throw it over your left shoulder and it works. You don't have to worry. It improves everything, basically improves the corrosion resistance, I should say, of all kinds of metals, and at low concentrations, it can be very effective. So Yeah, there are lots of applications, and primarily it's these days for protecting aluminum in aerospace applications. And we can get to it later. There are some replacements, but in the United States, there are still exemptions. Despite bans on the use of chromates, there are exemptions in the aerospace industry. I think it's largely been removed from automotive applications. But so there are workers, who are exposed to baths, chromate baths, that can aerosolize, and they're impacted. There are chromate fumes that come as a result of welding of stainless steels. So chromate is one of those applications that can impact workers, although workers in factories, it's sort of a controlled environment, right? So welding can be done anywhere, but in a factory, certainly you can capture the fumes, in either ventilator or otherwise take care of them. You can use personal protection for the workers, but still, it's a major concern. There are all kinds of chemicals that can impact people, but what did you were interested in other ways what was your question on this?
So
sorry, I lost the track. Maybe that can be edited out by your
no,
editors.
you actually answered it. So other products and industries that use some of these chemicals that have posed health complications. So I think
I could maybe add on that, because there have been like two things happening in Europe that might be interesting for North Americans to know about. So one was like the water-based painting. So you think like, oh, let's remove all the solvent. It's bad for the workers, right? So then you used water-based. But whenever you have water, you need preservatives. And the preservatives can cause skin allergies. And there was a new one, MIMCI, which was thought to be fine, right? And they added it only at 100 ppm or higher. But all those workers got like an epidemic of skin allergies. And this was noted very early by the dermatologists in Europe, and then it was banned or restricted below a certain limit. And a similar thing happened for the powder coating industry, where they started to use polyester TGIC coatings. And the TGIC, it's containing a chemical that causes issues. I think it's allergic asthma. And so the workers would be exposed to it while they are coating it. And generally, you can control worker exposure better in factories than outside or outdoors, or like in the small companies where they are doing everything on their own in new environments every time. And those chemicals usually cause bigger issues. So that TGIC has also been banned in Europe now.
I guess building on that pretty much directly, what are some of the challenges in replacing some of those chemicals or metals, if it's a metal that's posing the issue? Because it's easy to ban something, but then what do you use instead? Because there was a purpose to having that used, right? Jerry was commenting on chromate, where that will be a great corrosion inhibitor. So what are the challenges in just replacing the chemicals?
Let me talk about a few applications, if I can. So Yolanda's mentioned a number, and we could start with chromate. So the chromate is extraordinarily effective at this sort of smart coating, smart inhibition, right? Self-healing corrosion inhibition. So when corrosion initiates, it can be released into the environment and limit the attack. And it's been extremely difficult to replicate that with other chemicals. And as a result of that, in the aerospace industry, the chromate really needs to be somewhere, either in for outstanding corrosion protection, I would say. So either in the surface treatment or in the primer as a pigment. So there have been a number of coatings that are that provide really good corrosion protection. Those based on the trivalent chromium, the fluorozirconates that can be used in surface treatments, which is where a lot of the industry has gone for surface treatments. But getting that self-healing to the extent that the aerospace industry wants is extremely difficult, and then you have to rely on maintenance and repair. So I'll just mention a couple of others. Another of these magical chemicals that seems to benefit in their application is BPA. So that's bisphenol A, that it's received a lot of attention these days. It's added in polycarbonates and in bottles, like bottles used for drinking, and also in coatings, in food can coatings. So that's directly in contact with foodstuffs, and so certainly anything that's directly in contact with the water that we're drinking or the food that we're eating can be a problem. And there are these BPA free. Actually, the industry doesn't like to use the word BPA free because it's impossible to prove that there's no BPA. So they say BPA NI, which is not intentionally added. The NI, not intentional. And so there still might be some BPA. So there are now the BPA NI coatings, and they don't last as long. So the thing about canned food, which is something I've come to appreciate by working with the can industry, is the critical role that it plays in our society, right? So certainly there's some fraction of our society that really relies on canned food, although I would recommend fresh fruits and vegetables, which seem to be healthier. But canned food, is something that we all should have on our shelves in case of some emergency. There's all kinds of emergencies that could happen, and we need to be prepared for it. So, your pantry should have canned foods, and you should be replacing those cans because there's a limited shelf life. And so, by using these BPA NI coatings, that limits the shelf life, and you need to replace them more frequently. So, that's the issue there. We can replace them, but then there's impact in their application and their utility. The last one that I'll just mention I've had some exposure to are what's called PFAS. So you might know them as PFCs, perfluoro chemicals, and PFAS is per or polyfluoro alkyd substances, PFAS. So it's the same thing, and it's a huge family of chemicals. The fluorine containing, and I think we are most familiar with Teflon, which is just miraculous, right? As someone who ends up washing dishes a lot, right? So it's just amazing what it can do. But there are broad applications of PFAS, in clothing, for water repellent clothing, in firefighting. So it's a major chemical used in firefighting, and I know that the U.S. military, uses a huge amount of PFAS in training and in real life application to fight fires. So that gets dumped onto the ground and goes down into our water system. And these are also known as forever chemicals. So it's received a lot of attention because they are hard to break down, to get rid of, and they come into our bodies, and they can last a long time, have impact. And yeah, I can let Yolanda talk about the impact of health impact of these chemicals.
Yeah, so this belong to chemicals that they don't kill you directly, but the effect might be first visible in the second or third generation. So we call that, like, it's impacting reproducibility of people and animals, and it also impacts so that you transfer the chemicals. So children get higher and higher accumulation of those chemicals. So all of us actually have the chemicals in the blood measurable nowadays. There's no human left on Earth who doesn't have that. But so that's, and there have been research shows that there are effects on hormone levels on in the second and third generation. So it's really hard to notice that right away. When you would do like a risk or hazard assessment for those new chemicals, you would not see it has any effect on the first generation. So you think it's fine, right? So, but we now learn more and more that actually, for example, fish in lakes is affected by endocrine disruptors, which are these BPAs. They look similar to hormones for those animals as well as humans. So, for example, the menstruation cycle comes earlier and earlier in girls, and that is also correlated to some of those chemicals. So those effects are more and more known. Why the chemicals are on the list to be watched and maybe regulated.
What are some recent advancements and developments, and what's really driving them forward?
Yeah, maybe I can start with that because I know the European Union regulation, so that is regulated by the European Chemical Agency, ECHA, and there are a lot of relevant regulations. REACH is the chemical legislation. Usually it gives some years for the industry to adapt to a new legislation, and it also only applies for a certain tonnage or mass that you import or export. But it is becoming by nature stricter and stricter. So usually the industry has to take a responsibility for testing and proving that their stuff is safe or replacing the chemicals to comply with the European legislation. So for example, the aerospace industry has been exempt from chromium-6 10 years ago, but now it's not anymore. So in Europe, it's not allowed to use chromium-6, even in the aerospace industry. And it's looking very similar for other chemicals. And the other very important legislation is ROHS, so ROHS, which is also going through a lot of different toxic chemicals in electronics. And I would say what is really driving change is regulations. And in North America, it's mainly governed by lawsuits. And in Europe, it's mainly governed by those authority regulations, which are in turn influenced by scientists and physicians.
Yeah, I'll just add that the regulatory world is complicated, and I think it creates real problems for companies to deal with. So, I mean, Europe, as Yolanda says, Europe is often leading the way in these environmental issues, but even in the United States, there can be wide differences in local regulations. So the states regulate differently, right? California might regulate differently, and Europe's a big market. California is a big market. So so these companies have to deal with changing and variable regulations, and so in some ways maybe it's better to look at the worst case regulatory situation and just deal with it, and then you can apply it elsewhere. But clearly that's a driver.
And I'm going to ask a question building on that. What happens if, let's say, Europe or California passes a law that says, okay, we can't use this, and there isn't really a good viable replacement that can serve the same purpose? Then what? Do you use, as you mentioned, Jerry mentioned the BPA-NI, where it's okay, you're just not going to have as long of a shelf life, or is it you have enough lead time to develop something that maybe works as an interim until you can come up with a better replacement long term?
Yeah, so usually they improve the lead time. Yes. And they would also fund in Europe, they would also fund research that's looking for alternatives.
Okay, so you do have time to adapt, and perfect. With that, what are some of the areas that still need additional research?
Yeah, I think we need to get better into a complete life cycle assessment. Because, for example, when you think about a bridge that is corroding, you do have the chemicals in the paint or in the primer during the manufacturing, but you also have the metal itself, and that contains impurities, and those can be toxic as well. And you also have the sustainability. You want the bridge to last as long as possible. And it's a huge environmental and human health impact if you would need to replace the bridge very often, right? So therefore, you need to have a complete picture of the entire project. So we need better life cycle assessments by not only looking at one chemical at a time, but actually everything. And that should go into environmental impact assessments for the engineers and the project team. And then it would be good if also sublethal toxicity issues would be considered. So anything that is not directly killing you, basically. So because, for example, what happens if we pollute that entire lake with endocrine disruptors and the fish cannot reproduce anymore, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so Yolanda said a key word there, which is sustainability. Okay, so the corrosion community has been in the area of sustainability forever, but now it's a buzzword that attracts a lot of attention. So, the government companies are very involved in trying to improve sustainability. And the way that I think the major focus of sustainability, it deals with energy usage and carbon capture. But certainly we can, in our field, do a better job of explaining that corrosion is sustainability. Corrosion resistance is sustainability, right? So if something's corroding, it's by definition not sustainable. So I recently co-authored a paper where we looked at the cost of corrosion, not in terms of financial cost, but in terms of this was the cost of steel corrosion, in terms of the carbon release for the manufacture of steel that replaces corroded steel. But beyond that, I think that we can focus on the aspects that Yolanda mentioned. So sustainability, yeah, it involves energy, but also involves our environment. Okay, so if we are using materials for corrosion protection that can enter our environment and impact our health or the health of other species, then that's sustainability, right? That impacts the world sustainability. So we as a community, I think, need to focus on why corrosion is integral in the discussion of sustainability. And I think that will bring added resources and focus on corrosion, and that will benefit not just our community but the world. So yeah.
Well said. With that, is there anything else that either of you would like to add that we haven't touched on or covered today?
No, but thank you, Sammy, for bringing this topic to light and helping us get the word out about its importance.
And thank you both for joining me today. If any of our listeners wanted to follow up with you later, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Right, so I'm totally Googleable. You can find me if you Google Gerald Frankel or Ohio State corrosion. So you can email me, and I'm good at responding.
And the same for me. If you just write my name into Google, you will find me. I'm everywhere.
Wonderful. And with that, I'm Sammy Miles. I'm here with Yolanda Hedberg and Jerry Frankel. And thanks for listening to another episode of Corrosion Journal Interview Series. You can subscribe to AMP Podcasts if you haven't already on Apple, Google, Spotify, and all the major distributors. If you want to learn more about the journal, make sure to visit corrosionjournal.org. You can find all episodes of AMP Podcasts on amp.org. That's ampp.org. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for listening.